Hello, hello, hello. It's 7 o'clock and it is Tuesday. Let me get myself situated here. Okay. Give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay. So it's Tuesday. Hello, everyone. Making sure I have everything set up so I can see. And see my comments while I'm talking. And get my volume back up. So, it is Tuesday, and I am here to talk to you all again. This is my regular thing and a part of, Kendall Autism Support and Consulting. So, I can see, making sure everything is in place where I need it to be. Okay, so I always want to start out by introducing myself. So, I am Tanika Mayhew Butler, and I'm a recently retired educator. I retired after 27 years, not 21. I don't want to take any of my years away. 27 years in the public school system, but I am also the parent of a 22-year-old daughter on the autism spectrum. And from our journey with our daughter, her name is Kendall. We have 2 kids. We have a son and a daughter, and Kendall is the youngest. Her brother is 23 and Kendall is 22. We've learned a lot on our autism journey, and a big part of what I noticed while we were on our journey was that we really kind of felt alone. Like there was no one really talking about autism. Some of the things that we were dealing with, having to try to figure out on our own. So it was something that stayed with me. And over time, I started kind of sharing information at conferences, and recently I moved forward and formed Kendall Autism Support and Consulting. And so using that platform, I'm able to go into businesses. Businesses need training. I know a lot of people forget about that. They always think about teachers, but businesses also need to be made aware about autism and how to best support individuals on the autism spectrum. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things real quick and kind of tell you what brought about the topic for today. So yesterday, because Kendall is now 22 in the state of Georgia where we live, she has officially aged out of school. And so because she has officially aged out of school, we're now looking for a day program. And part of that is, visiting different day programs and kind of seeing what the fit is, whether or not they think she's going to be a good fit for their program. So a part of that comes into what has the topic I'm going to talk about today. And that is because Kendall not only has an autism diagnosis, Kendall also has an intellectual disability. And I think that we probably need to make sure everybody understands what that really means, because there's a difference when you talk about intelligence compared to autism, and compared to when we're starting to think about individuals who are nonverbal. So I just wanted to really kind of hop on here quickly and make sure we understand what those differences are. So when someone is identified with an intellectual disability, they fall into the category when it comes to programming of what's called IDD. They are an individual with a developmental disability. And so what that means is they have an intellectual and developmental disability. So what that means is that when we start to think about intelligence, we always hear these numbers. We hear people talk about, a person that's a genius and, and different things. But there's a level. So when we think about a genius, and I wanted to make sure I didn't mess these numbers up. When it comes to intelligence, when you're thinking about a genius, that's someone that has an IQ above 130. And that's really only about 2 to 3% of the population. Then when we move down to the next range, which is 110 to 130. That's about 15 to 20% of the population. And they're considered to be above average. Now, about 50% of the population falls within 90% to 110%. So that's their level of intelligence. And then we have where people are considered to be below average, and that's 70 to 90. And I know you're like, that's a lot of numbers, you know, when you're looking at this, and that's about 25 to 30% of the population. Well, then you have that percentage that falls below 70. And those individuals are identified by having what's called an intellectual disability. So Kendall has an autism diagnosis, and she also has an intellectual disability diagnosis. So those really are two different things. That means her level of intelligence falls below 70. And then she also has an autism diagnosis, which puts her on the spectrum as well. So, hey, Seabrooks. And so it's so important that we understand there is a difference. So when we start talking about individuals with an intellectual disability, understand we're talking about people where their IQ falls below 70. And even when you get below 70, that starts to break down into levels like mild and moderate and severe. But I want everybody to understand that Kendall has there's a dual diagnosis there, autism along with an intellectual disability. And that's where I think people miss sometimes. And part of the reason I'm bringing that up is because, you know, I run into a lot of people, and when they hear what I'm doing right now, or when they hear me say something about my daughter being on the autism spectrum, and then I get conversations that'll start with different people, and, you know, they'll tell me how someone they know that's on the autism spectrum is now driving or, you know, working or living independently. And what we've got to realize is that for some individuals on the autism spectrum, yes, they're going to be able to learn how to drive. They're going to be able to function in society. But the reason that is because their IQ is above 70. So we've got to remember, when I tell you Kendall has autism and an intellectual disability, that means her IQ falls below 70. So there are some things in life that are going to be a challenge for her, but there are also some things that she probably will never comprehend and understand to do in life. And that's because of her level of intelligence. So we've got to realize, just because someone has an autism diagnosis, it does not mean that their level of intelligence is not there. And so that's where we get into the whole thing as well. When we hear someone say that someone is nonverbal, that basically could mean a couple of things. And we've got to understand, just because someone is nonverbal does not mean they have a low level of intelligence. Their way of speaking may be different. So they may not be verbal, like I am verbally speaking to you. They may communicate through a device, pictures, body gestures, whatever the case may be. But just because someone is nonverbal does not automatically mean they have a low IQ. And I think people have kind of meshed all those things together, that when they hear autism, they think low intelligence. And that's not true. Autism is a spectrum, and intelligence basically has a range. And so we've got to realize those are two different things. So we've got to, move away from being afraid of our child being diagnosed with autism, because autism is just one diagnosis. It has absolutely nothing to do with their level of intelligence and how smart they are, as we want to think about things. So it's not that all kids who have autism won't accomplish things in society. And that's what we've got to move away from, thinking that, and thinking that it's such a, a great accomplishment when someone on the autism spectrum, hey, Granny, graduates from the top of their class. They are on the autism spectrum, but they also have a high IQ. So we really want to make sure we're paying attention to those things, that there is a difference here. When we start to think about autism and how there is a spectrum when it comes to autism, and intelligence, there are different ranges, and Kendall falls in the range that is below 70, which means now as an adult, she is considered to be in a category of IDD. She's an individual with an intellectual and a developmental disability. So if you hear someone, hey Yoki, if you hear someone say that someone is an IDD individual, that means that person has an intellectual and a developmental disability as an adult. And so what that means and what that looks like, that basically means their thinking, how they learn things, how they problem solve is different, but they still have strengths and weaknesses like any other child, any other young adult. And so the more you interact with that person, the more you're going to learn about their strengths and weaknesses. But we've got to make sure we understand that autism is one spectrum and a person's intelligence is a different range. So referring to Kendall, Kendall is autistic and Kendall also has an intellectual disability. So right now, at the age of 22, as we're moving forward with services, we're looking for services for someone that is identified as IDD. So if you hear someone say that someone is IDD, it means that person has an intellectual and a developmental disability. Now, what brought me to this is, once again, I mentioned we were out this week visiting a day program, and I heard about a situation where, you know, with the individual, but the individual in their moment of elopement went into a bank, and that bank understood that that person was IDD. So I want to make sure if you hear that someone say that someone is IDD, that you understand that they're telling you they have an IQ that falls below 70. And so that means the way you interact with them, you've got to be aware that you're dealing with someone that their thinking and learning and problem solving probably don't fall on the same level as someone above 70. So it's real easy to get the two confused, and we think autism and then we think, you know, intelligence, but they're separate things. And we want to make sure in society that we understand just because someone has an autism diagnosis does not mean their level of intelligence falls below 70. And because we have individuals who are not on the autism spectrum, we all know, who their intelligence falls below 70. So keep that in mind. You may hear someone say that someone is IDD, and if you do, that's what they mean. But understand, someone that is IDD can live a life that is, you know, a functional part of society. So they're working, living independently. It does not mean that they're not going to be able to do those things. They're just going to face different challenges in how they're able to accomplish those things. So for Kendall, we face those challenges in how she's able to accomplish different things. She's independent and taking care of herself, but her problem solving isn't always there. And her life skills when it comes to safety, that's a big part of things. So we want to make sure we take care of her because the problem solving may not be there, along with that full self-care. She knows how to take care of things, but you sometimes have to remind her. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to keep it long tonight. I've kind of realized I probably have been going a little more longer than I should be when I hop on here. So I definitely wanted to hop on here and explain those differences because I think people are meshing them all together as one, and they're not one thing. Next thing I want to point out is what I point out every week. Make sure that we are getting those state IDs. Do not rely on the school ID for our loved ones just because they have an intellectual disability. Hey, cousin. We want to make sure that we're getting them their state IDs. The same way we make sure that individuals get their learner's permit, we want to make sure we are getting them. Hey, Dr. Heather. We want to make sure we're getting state IDs. And, you know, that's something that we probably need to encourage a little bit more, you know, in the school system, just encouraging parents to go ahead and get them a state ID and not rely heavily on the school ID. They deserve a state ID the same way you have a state ID. And it's one of those things that they'll be able to see. It doesn't matter their level of intelligence. You're getting them a state ID. Look into what your state has for requirements. Take those requirements in. And then when they get their state ID, they're going to have something that looks just like your ID. So how exciting that is. We get excited when we think about when we got our learner's permit. They're going to get just as excited to get their state ID, to take that picture, to go in there and do everything just like everyone else. Sometimes we want to remove those experiences from their life, and we've got to realize those experiences are just as important. So getting that state ID is an experience that we want to make sure that we're not taking away from them on this journey of life. So if you remember anything from tonight, remember there is a difference, and I cannot say that enough, when it comes to an autism diagnosis and that's a spectrum. And when it comes to someone's level of intelligence, they are two different things. So it shouldn't blow everybody's mind or be this great thing that happens when someone that's on the autism spectrum graduates at the top of their class. Just because someone has autism does not mean their intelligence level is low. Intelligence is a range, and Kendall falls in the range where her intelligence falls below 70. But that's not the case for all individuals on the autism spectrum. And that's why I tell people Kendall has an autism diagnosis and intellectual disability. The two together are who she is and how we have to make sure we live her life and help her, navigate through the system. So share that information with someone to make sure people understand that there's a difference between the two. Along with non-speaking. Non-speaking does not mean a person has a low IQ as well. That just means they communicate in a different way, and their form of communication will probably blow your mind at some of the things that are out there when it comes to technology. I've had a student that was able to navigate his laptop through his eyes. And when I questioned it, it surprised me because he wanted me to see, because I just was like, how does this work? And he used his laptop to take a picture of us. So, and everything was solely by his eyes. So understand, just because a person does not, they're nonverbal, does not mean they have a low IQ. We've got to make sure we're separating things and looking at the individual for who they are and all of the different parts that make them who they are. And there are different parts that make them who they are, along with there are different parts that make me who I am, along with everyone else. But we sometimes get so caught up on the one thing, we forget about the other parts of who the person is. So join me next week, share, tag. We've got to have these conversations so people can understand some of this terminology. And like I said, that came up for me based on that visit, and the person mentioned that the individual, was IDD. And I was wondering if other people heard that, would they know what that meant to say that someone is IDD when you see a young adult? And so it made me want to make sure I explained what that meant when someone is IDD and how that is different from a diagnosis of autism. Those are two different things. Those are two different diagnoses for a person to have. So join me next week. Like, share, post. I'm here every Tuesday trying to share information that I want people to get so we can have a more inclusive society. And coming back to ending with the whole thing again, if you haven't picked up a copy, Crusade for Kindle, it's available on Amazon. It's our journey of hope, because we've had highs and lows on our journey, and I wanted to make sure we shared that journey with others so people don't feel alone. That's what it's all about. We want to make sure people aren't feeling alone, they're feeling supported. And then there is a recent workbook I've completed, and the workbook is for anyone, and it's here to kind of help you. It's not a chapter book, but it has resources. It's about 100 pages, and it's a quick flip, quick resource. You're trying to figure out how to best support someone. The holidays are coming up, sensory issues. I'm going to talk more about that at another time. But thank you all for joining me tonight. Share this information so we make sure everyone knows when someone says a young adult is IDD, what that actually means and how they need to make sure they're interacting, because that means that person has an IQ that falls below 70, but it doesn't mean that that person cannot live a fulfilling life. That does not mean that person cannot have a job. They can have a job and still live independently. So share this information so that we can make sure people understand. The more people understand, the more inclusive we will become as a society, and more families will start to leave home because they're going to feel comfortable. And that's what it's all about. So have a great one. It's Tuesday. Join me next week. We'll have another conversation about another topic.